And some, and these different questions will come up. I noticed something. I was thinking about this, actually talking to some friends about this the other day. I think without maybe one or two exceptions, whenever somebody came to Jesus, regardless of their anger or their inquiry or whatever, he always responded with a question. Maybe one or two times he didn't. But other than that, it's always with a question. And why? It's because he's not at risk. So they're bringing their question that they got right at the surface, but he knows that's not the real deal here. So he is asking them another question to bring something that is more about them and about what matters to them to the surface. Right? And yeah, it may be kind of fuel to the fire at times, but it's because that person matters to Jesus. So who they are matters. And he's after that with a question. So those questions become really significant. And I think that's part of what you guys do in teaching people how to listen. And because listening is more than half a conversation. I was with a guy the other night, to give you an example, and I understand him. He's a little bit older than me, and he got a lot of my dad in terms of, he's out there to do great work for God. And we're sitting at the table, and I watch him talk over top of everybody. Now, that's not a judgment or a value statement. It's an observation. There's a huge difference, right? It's just his, you can see his whole history in that, whether he was never listened to by his dad or whether he feels he needs to make sure everybody knows that he's doing something that matters. Who knows what the reasons are? But I watch him do this. In the middle of it, his wife gets a phone call, and one of her best friends had died. In the middle of this conversation, right? And I watch him, it stops him for a minute, and he reaches over and he says, "I am so sorry." And then he turns back and goes back to his agenda because he didn't know how to listen, right? And it's not that he won't learn, because we're all in this process of trying to learn. But a lot of times we don't know how to listen, and because we're at risk. We've got to be on top of the conversation, and we've got to tell somebody else what we think in order for them to feel good about us. And a lot, because I know that history in me, and a lot of it was driven by shame. I felt so worthless about myself that I wanted to keep talking so that you didn't ask me anything that actually mattered, and might expose the fact that I hated myself, because I didn't want you to come into the shack and find out what I was really like. You understand? So we do these kinds of things, and part of the beauty of story and questions like those is that it's an invitation into that holy ground. And I get that, because I know where I come from, and I know why. I know myself pretty well, and it was not an easy journey getting there. Let me tell you, I would never want to go through what I had to go through in order to find out how to deal with the stuff that was in my life. You bury all that stuff, and you create a facade outside the shack and paint it as fast as you can pick up people's expectations, and you just hope they never want to come in. Because if you're a Christian evangelical like I was, we didn't run away from relationships. We just heard God call us somewhere else. So, thank you. This one works. Awesome, good. Makes it easier.
I actually have two things.
Okay.
Number one is tell us about the film.
Okay.
And secondly, can you tell us a story of Papa Muguni and your growing up that helped to form your whole self?
Sure. The movie. Now, you have to understand, I wasn't trying to be an author, right? So I'm more an accidental author than anything. And it was kind of weird to write Crossroads because I had to do that one on purpose. And but because of that, there were no agreements and things like that. So we had to work all of that out, it's quite a process. In that, I laid the movie down. I put the movie on the table as part of that process, and it's why the process worked. And so I stepped away from it, and so there, it was crafted inside an agreement, and So I've watched, as anybody is, outside, and you hear the rumors, and suddenly Oprah's going to be playing Papa, and then you hear the rumors, and then different people are attached to it, and then it doesn't happen, and then, because Hollywood's all smoke and mirrors anyway. So it's been a fascinating process. Well, within the last week, suddenly it's come right back to the surface. And from what I understand, because I got a call and they've invited me to look at the screenplay as it is now, that's pretty great, because I don't have any rights to that, and I was absolutely not anticipating even being invited to that piece. So it's pretty cool. But for the word right now is that Octavia Spencer will play Papa, that they start filming in May in Vancouver, BC. Now, I don't know if this is actually real. It's kind of real. But you know what it does? Pushes me right back into the grace of a day. And this is what I've said about a movie. I don't understand the purposes of God. And if you read Hebrews chapter 11, it's going to look really different in different situations. Sometimes it's really powerful, and sometimes it's hiding in a hole in the ground. Right? And understand, the purposes of God are served by very different things. And I would tell people, look, if the purposes of God are better served by a really crappy movie, I'm in. You understand how freeing that is? Because my identity's not hooked to it. My agenda, I don't have an agenda with regard to it. So I get to participate inside the grace of the day as it unfolds. I could be dead by tomorrow. Just telling you. I don't know if that's a shock to you, but I could have some cell go sideways in this, and all the worry that I spend on the future and stuff, useless, right? So I'd rather be present inside the grace of the day. You know what happens? When you're present inside the grace of the day, you suddenly start seeing things everywhere that you would not be present otherwise to see. The activity of God. And I see it like my grandkids do. Because kids know how to stay inside the grace of the day. They're not going like, hey, I don't know how exactly this fits into my 5-year plan. I don't know if I should be going down this slide at this kind of speed. You know? The other question you had was, and it wasn't Papua New Guinea. It was Irian Jaya. New Guinea is a split island, and half of it was an Australian colony called PNG, Papua New Guinea, and the other half was a Dutch colony. So I have a Canadian passport because I was born in Canada. My sister had a Dutch passport because she was born in Hollandia. My brother Tim was born in the same hospital but had a UN passport because at that point nobody knew who owned it and the Dutch hadn't jumped ship. So, and then my brother Stephen was born with an Indonesian passport because Sukarno showed up in the harbor of that hospital, where that hospital is, where he was born, same room as my brother and sister, but Sukarno was in charge, so he had an Indonesian passport, which made border crossings really interesting. So I grew up in the highlands of New Guinea. Now, New Guinea has over 800 unrelated language groups. Right? It's an anthropologist's dream world. They're still looking for the Tower of Babel somewhere in the central part of New Guinea. Because how do you explain 800 plus unrelated language groups? Right? It's really a phenomenon. My tribe was in the highlands that I grew up with. I was a year old when we went in. Pioneer missions, incredibly dangerous when you look back. But this was the time where it was about the mission. And my dad was a hunter-trapper, coming from his background, a logger in British Columbia, trained by his dad to be a hunter-trapper. And so he didn't have the chip to be a dad, because his dad had already broken that, right? And before him, my grandfather my great-grandfather had broken my grandfather's ability to be a father. I mean, I know my history because my aunt is a historian. And so our family history is pretty locked in. And my dad didn't have that. And he really didn't. And he didn't know how to do that. So he was one of my great sadnesses as a child. He was a strict disciplinarian, as they would say in the old days. But he didn't know. He didn't know how to do. And that's a whole other story about me and my dad. We're the best we've ever been, just so you know. So that was a huge deal. I'm inside of tribal, Stone Age, warring, ritualistically cannibal tribe. They're my family. They raised me. Donnie was my first language, right? When I was 5 years old, Wycliffe came in to try to translate the language, and I was the informant, because I was the only one that could speak Donnie in English. Now, our tribe was big, 40 to 60,000 people over 100 square miles. Right? Big tribe. Now, they were my family. So the next major shock loss in my life, other than the sexual abuse that started inside the tribal culture and then was continued in boarding school, at the Christian missionary boarding school, which really is the story of Missy, really. The other big shock loss was sent to boarding school. That's when I lost my family, I lost my tribe, I lost my color. Because I didn't know I was white when I went to boarding school. It was a huge disappointment. Right? I mean, I didn't know. It was not a conscious thing but I lost everything. And so if you're around missionary kids or diplomat kids or kids that have been moved between cultures, third culture kids, one of the major issues that they face is the issue of belonging. The issue of belonging. And if you don't find someone to belong to, you never belong anywhere. It's never about geography. It's about relationship. And one of the things you guys do is you give people space to belong. And you listen to them. I mean, how powerful is that? Because a lot of times in the church structure that I grew up in, you know, when people's stuff showed up, they were escorted out, which made the rest of us really want to be open and transparent and authentic, and, you know? And it was just part of how that culture functioned. So that had a huge role to play in terms of how I then became someone who was struggling with these issues that ended up inside my storylines that you can read. And it's there. So, but being multicultural, I think, of course, if you've read The Shack, you know that, you know, the guy that's at the center of all the problems is a little white, sort of balding, middle-aged, you know, little overweight white guy. And I needed a God who was bigger than the Gandalf with the bad attitude, right? The distant, white, mask. Because frankly, most of my damage came from men. And so I needed another bridge in, and that became the maternal side of the character of God. And so I used imagery that was a violation in a sense of my history and tradition, but it's not. It's very biblical. But imagery was never intended to define God. It was intended to help us understand elements of the facets of the character of God. You know, it's windows through which we see an element of who God is. And all of maternity originates in God. All of paternity originates in God. And so to play with those images, because God is a rock, you know that. God's a rock, right? That's what it says, God's a rock. And he's a fortress and a strong tower, and he's a shield, and he's a nursing mother in Isaiah, and he's a woman who loses a coin, and he's a father waiting for a son, and he is a mother hen who covers the chicks. It's all imagery. But you know he's not a rock. But you know what that means. You get a picture of what that means, and it means something to you. Well, that's what I did. I played with imagery. And you know what? It turned out that imagery spoke volumes to millions of people. They were able to suddenly have a conversation about God that wasn't religious. And they were given permission to tell their stories and the losses that they'd experienced so that they could cry the tears that would be collected, that would matter. And that's what happened inside this little thing I wrote on the train to try to get to one of my 3 jobs so that I could give it to my kids at Christmas. And so thank you for the question. Do we have time for one more? Yeah. There's one over here. Sean has one.
Can you hold your hand up?
Perfect.
I have 2 quick questions. How do you handle the success of the Shack, and how do you stay humble with that? And my second question is, do you have a favorite author?
Cool. So, Well, I stay humble by, you don't know who I'm married to, brother. I married both the love of God and the wrath of God. And thank God that I didn't marry some meek, mild, Christian, submitted woman. Let me tell you, she came after me with every piece of fury she had, and it saved my life. I'm serious. Saved my life. So part of getting to the place where, when I tell people 15 copies did everything I ever wanted that book to do, it's true. The other thing I like people to know is that everything that mattered to me was in place before I wrote it. That is my identity, my worth, my value, my significance, my security, my meaning, my purpose, my destiny, my community, my love. All of those things were in place. So the book hasn't added any of that to me. And I am so aware of how wild and crazy this is. I'll give you a couple examples, because The Shack is the #2 book in the history of Brazil in Portuguese. Right? I mean, it's just has been a bombshell that's gone off in Brazil. And you know who my #1 distributor in Brazil is? Because they don't have a distribution system on the ground. It's Avon. Avon has sold almost 2 million copies of The Shack in Brazil. Oh yeah, I planned that. But, you know, this last summer I was in Croatia. Kim and I and Wes and Linda Yoder went to Croatia because the Ministry of Culture invited me to come to Croatia because the country had unofficially adopted The Shack as their book of the decade. And when Crossroads came out, they picked that one up. And so they wanted me to come talk to the country, which, you know, 30% of the population has been lost in devastating war and family divide and horrible things. We live in a world that generates a massive amount of darkness. You know, what do we do about that? We learn how to love the one who's in front of us. That's how we learn how to deal with that. We learn to look at ourselves and be inside those conversations without disappearing and all of those kinds of things. So for me, this is such a massive, monumental thing that I'd have to be a greater fool than I've ever been in order not to understand that this is something that is totally inside the kindness and sense of humor and the grace of God. So the humility piece, I know where I come from, and I don't make any bones about what it took to get there. And so, you know, I walk with a limp. I'm Jacob. That's me. You know, I walk with a limp, and if you want to know what that limp is, I'll tell you. And I'll tell you what I did. And I can look back where things were stolen from me as a child, no doubt. But then I turn around and I broke a bunch of things. Right? And so how do you deal with regret? How do you deal with working that out? You do, inside relationship. And then you learn how to let things go. And every one of those areas of our lives, the question is, where's God? Where's God in the middle of this? Is God good all the time? Because frankly, this is a journey about learning how to trust. It is. And we practice it with each other. But learning how to trust, it's not about trying to please God, because that's easy. All you have to do is get somebody that's got a short list of rules. You know? Because then it's easier. Then you just know what you're supposed to do. And then it's kind of magic. God's supposed to do what he's supposed to do. But it's not about that. It's learning how to trust. And you can't trust someone who's not good all the time. You can't trust someone that you don't know loves you. And those are huge questions inside of our humanity that have to be asked and talked about. And at some point, it's got to be okay. It's got to be okay that I don't have the answers. It's got to be okay that I want to scream, why? And it's got to be okay that my response to things that are wrong is fury. Because I think that's the right response. It's the human response. It's a real response. And then it raises all these other questions. And I've learned to love the questions. Favorite authors, depends on what we're talking about. Because I read, and whether I was reading Edgar Rice Burroughs or Tom Swift or some, you know, classic Gulliver's Travels or those, I love those things. But I read heavy theology and heavy sociology. I read a lot, and like Jacques Ellul that nobody knows about, but he's a French sociologist and theologian, wrote 20 books on sociology and 20 on theology. And I like that because I find that I'm a translator interpreter. That's kind of how I function. I take these massive ideas that people have written beautifully about, and I put them in language that other people can access. And that's part of how I get to be myself. I'm not trying to be like somebody else anymore. I'm just learning to be a child, and I like it. Being an adult's too much work. You know, I like this being a child thing. And that I think is part of humility as well. But I love Lewis, and I think one of the best books ever written. It's a little hard to wade through if you try to do the original, but it's Unspoken Sermons by George MacDonald, Creation in Christ, which is a whole series of sermons that he wasn't allowed to preach because he wasn't allowed to preach them. But they're beautiful, they're stunning, and they raise huge questions. And there's an edited version by Roland Hine, if anybody cares. But I love A.W. Tozer. He comes from he's my history, right? That's CMA. But I like good storytelling, and I like a good biography. So I'm not kind of all over the place on that. Same with music. There's certain kinds of music that doesn't take me long to get tired of, but there are other kinds that I just like. Come on. I get tired of Christian music a lot easier than most music, but that's because they only have 250 words in their vocabulary. Yes. This is Jonathan, by the way, John.
I'm a pastor, and I grew up in fundamentalism myself, and so one of the ministries I end up having is with people who are like me, who have to unlearn a lot of God before they can trust God.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've heard you talk about in other places before is talking about the wrath of God, because that's a big piece of a lot of religious people's concept of God, and then their damage subsequently. So can you unpack the wrath of God?
Wow. Okay, so his last little easy question. Coming from a fundamentalist background himself, is could I unpack the wrath of God in 20 words or less? So, let me just back up a second and give you a couple little things that I think might help you. Until you're free to not be part of a religious institution, you're not free yet. But until you're free to be part of one, you're not free yet either. Freedom has got nothing to do with the constraints that you're put in. It's like significance. I'm significant because of who I am, not what I do. So I am totally free to clean toilets. Do you understand? And I'm good at it, just so you know. Right? I did it enough times. But I'm saying freedom is not about the constraints. So I'm free to be inside any religious institutional system on the planet, because my freedom is not constrained by that. Do you understand? Now, I had to go through a time where I had to step away, like a lot of us do, because there's got so much damage connected to it in one form or another. And institutions do that. I mean, that again is an observation, not a value statement, because institutions aren't even alive. You know, they have no life in them. They have less life than rocks. But if you take the human beings out of them, they cease to exist. And it's human beings that matter here. So, and here's another line. And I love this, because I think this is directly from the Holy Spirit, and you won't find it in the Bible, but I still think the Holy Spirit is talking. So, last I heard anyway, even though I didn't grow up that way. And but here's the line. The only time you'll find God in a box is because he wants to be where we are. Isn't that's stunning brilliant, isn't it? The only time you'll find God in a box is because he wants to be where I am. Because it's me who matters. And that gives me a huge amount of freedom. These questions about like the wrath of God, which George MacDonald talks a lot about in Unspoken Sermons. You know, I had the distant, unapproachable, unreachable, Gandalf with the bad attitude God. That's the God I grew up with. And that God never showed up and healed one thing in my life. It was always about me trying to get across some bridge between me and that God. And thank even that God that he was kind enough to send Jesus to protect me from him. But that was my concept. Jesus came to save me from God the Father. Right? So I was all distorted up inside the relationship that exists within the very being of God. But that was my heritage. And so part of that is to see this wrathful, angry God, and I believe in the wrath of God, trust me. But that's because, frankly, I have children. And I'm married to the wrath of God. Right? Kim loves me. Right? I love my children. I'll give you a great example, because I think the wrath of God is the love of God in a different expression, right? So, and I think this is why the shack was so hard for so many people, because it was so wrenching, because it tapped into the deepest place of their ability to love, which is between a parent and a child. I am convinced that the greatest loss a human being will ever experience is between a parent and a child. Not even between spouses, right? It's the parent and a child. That's bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. That, and there's a verse that says, if you being wicked, and the word wicked doesn't mean sinful stuff, it means twisted up. It's the old English for wickerware. You know, it's all twisted up. If you being all twisted up know how to agape, other-centered, self-giving love, your children, how much more God? That's what the verse says, right? So, I got a daughter, Amy. Amy has a brain tumor. Right? She's been fighting this thing for 8 years now. It sits on the backside of her pituitary gland. It is not, it's benign, but it grows. So she's had to take cabergoline, which is an oral form of chemo, twice a week for the last 8 years. It took 20 weeks to find this thing, and that thing, I hate it. It's a piece of tissue that doesn't belong there, right? And so, because of this little piece of tissue, it pushed Amy into a process in which she began to listen to the lies that all of us hear the whispers of, which is, you're just not enough. And in her case it was, you're damaged goods. Nobody could really, like a man, no man could really love you because you're damaged goods. You have a brain tumor, which affects her hormonally, it affects other parts of her systems, right? So she starts thinking, or hearing the whisper, and starts to believe it, that I'm just damaged goods. And when you believe a lie about yourself, then suddenly you become a target for destructive things. And she was in a destructive relationship that hurt her very, very badly. Here's the deal. I'm her dad. I would step in front of a bullet for that girl, as I would for any of my kids. I'm her father. Give me the power and the fiery fury that could not only climb inside her brain and destroy that little piece of tissue, but even deeper. Let me destroy that lie that she has begun to believe about herself. And that lie is now destroyed in her. It doesn't mean the whisperer doesn't come back, because we have this fundamental sense that we're not enough, which is not the truth. And so I understand the fury of God that goes against anything that hurts the ones he loves. And I believe that's the wrath of God. It is, I am coming after everything. And here's McDonald's, to wrap it up, in a McDonald quote from Unspoken Sermons. If you trust the character of this God, you will run to this God with your arms wide open and you will say, come on, please judge me to the core. Burn out of me everything that keeps me from being free and fully human and fully alive. That's different than the way I grew up. I had a retributive, punitive God that was just looking for a reason to make sure I didn't make it. Right? This is a God who pursues us. This is the woman who searches her house looking for her coin because it's precious to her. This is for the shepherd who will leave the 99 to go find the one. And guess what? You're the one. You're the one. I'm the one. And I love that. And so I'm saying, like, come on, everybody goes through fire. Everybody was salted with fire. That's all scripture. Right? This is the love of God. This is the wrath of God who's going to come and dismantle everything in me that's not right and not good. And I don't want it. At the core of my being, at the deepest place of who I am, I don't want any darkness. When I know the truth of who I am, then the way of who I am begins to change. And that's why we need each other. We need each other to tell us what is the truth about our being. Who are we? And let me figure it out inside relationship. Because you can't get any deeper in the character of God than relationship. Right? So, thank you for letting me tell some stories. Thank you for allowing me to be here this evening, and especially for this kind of event, which I'm thrilled about. And I have read the book, just so you know.